So thank you all for joining us today for a special guest talk by Andrés Burbano. It's my pleasure to introduce Andrés to you today and welcome him to MIT. A little bit about Andrés. He is a researcher, curator, and interdisciplinary artist. He's currently a professor in the Arts and Humanities School at the Open University of Catalunya in Barcelona. He's also a visiting lecturer at Donau Universitat in Austria. However, he spent most of his academic career at the School of Architecture and Design at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. And he is currently serving in the very demanding and actually very prestigious role of chair of SIGGRAPH 2024, which is the premier conference on computer graphics and interactive technologies and techniques worldwide. And now a little bit about Andrés' work. His research projects focus on media history, media archaeology, and the historical and cultural impacts of computational technologies in Latin America and the Global South. And today he's going to be talking to us about his recent, very exciting new book called Different Engines, Media Technologies from Latin America. And in his book, Andrés investigates and he uncovers the emergence in Latin America of different technologies for image and sound creation, for video games and physical interactions. And most importantly, he introduces an historiographical and theoretical framework for bringing to light and uncovering and revealing and understanding the work of creators who have been marginalized geographically and historically. And he's going to talk to us and tell us about some untold stories of creators and technological creations. So thank you very much for coming, and please join me in welcoming Andrés today.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me fine? Okay, let's start. I have lots of slides. I know that it's noon, so it's time for you to probably be eating something. So I really appreciate that you came. So the goal of the presentation today is to introduce you to the book that I published last year. It's a publication in Routledge in the Design, Technology, and Society book series that Professor Terry Knight, it's the co-editor with Daniel Cardoso from CMU. The book is entitled Different Engines, Media Technologies from Latin America. And it has two different parts. One that we can consider more media archaeology, checking into origins of photographic processes, color television systems, and analog computational projects to compose music in Chile in the 78. The first case study is 1832, right? And then the second part of the book is called Site Tracking, and it's about software and hardware studies. So I'm going to try to give an overview of the book, the background and the intentions. Let's say there are two corpuses that are behind the book, right? Trying to understand first the history of media technology in Latin America. In general, the history of media technology in Latin America is explained through the idea of technology transfer, right? Like something that comes from Europe or the States, Japan, and it's adapted or transformed in Latin America, which accounts for a very important part of what happens in technology. But there's another interesting branch that is like, let's say, technologies that are being produced in Latin America, right? And many people created concepts like Creole technologies, for instance, or if we are referring back in the past, indigenous technologies, or technologies like computational technologies that we don't know very well that interesting processes happening there. So this was the first corpus, let's say, and the second one is something that is probably most familiar to you. That is like the history of computing, history of computing machinery. But especially, right, like I was involved in this because I had the chance to once had an interview with the son of Konrad Zuse, the Horst Zuse is his name, who was responsible of building one of the first mechanical computers and one of the first electromechanical computers worldwide. And he recorded his data and instructions in punch film stock, in film, instead of punch cards, okay? So that was something that interested me, and I got trapped into that world, but mainly with the idea to identify of these machines, you know, from the analytical engine, let's say, to the MONIAC, you know, the last computers that were designed in the 40s. What are the connections with either media or technology, right? Like how the analytical engine has already some mentions of using that machine for music purposes, you know, for composing, or eventually the connection of the C1 and C3 with cinema because of the use of punch film stock, or the first uses of the Manchester Mark I to compose poetry or music or, you know, installations, let's say. So those are the two main fields, right, like the corpuses. At the theoretical level, let's say I'm familiar with media archaeology, science and technology studies, decolonial theory, media art history. That is what I'm trying to combine. And even though I love these fields, let's say there is also a reclamation, right? Let's say, even though I engage very much with media archaeology, the concepts like deep time of the media, the cartography of media and materiality, I also question why media archaeology is focused mainly in examples coming from Europe, the States, and Japan, right? So the geographical diversity is not very high. Or let's say STS, when they engage with media, you know, cases are related to media technologies, they usually ignore the philosophy behind media, like McLuhan, for instance, right? They talk about media, and sometimes they forget that there's a long tradition of philosophers talking about media from in the entire 20th century, right? So that, same with the colonial theory. Let's say I focus a lot on relationality. It's something that is very important to my work. At the same time, I question why they don't care much about technology, right? And it's very needed, and so on and so forth. So let's jump into the content of the part one, backtracking. As I told you, this is more like media archaeology, history of photography, history of color television, history of early computing, let's say personal computers in Chile to compose music. So if I can share something that I haven't shared before, let's say that I prepared for this talk, is kind of the map that is behind every single chapter, right? Like trying to focus on the case study, right? Identify a key author in the field, and one particular or some particular concepts that are, you know, familiar to that author, but then negotiate that with the case study, let's say, focus on the technical description of the apparatus, paying attention to the local history, the local context, but also the global historical context, right? To see if we, let's say, talk about photography, not just what happened with photography in Brazil at a time, but, you know, what happened at a time in France, for instance. That is the canonical history of photography. I try to engage also with one author that is usually local that already talk about this case, you know, like trying to avoid the idea that we are discovering things, right? Like, and instead, you know, establishing dialogues with people who already work in those fields. One thing that at the methodological level is a distinctive aspect of what I do in this part of the book is that because in many cases the technical descriptions were not complete, I decided to follow the technical descriptions and do technical reenactments of those technologies, right? Engage in a practical way, trying to bring these technologies alive. So one example, right? These images, what we see now, describe, let's say, what happened with the photographic techniques in Brazil. So listen, we are going back to 1832. 7 years before the first patent to photography was given in France to Daguerre, there was one French guy coming from Monaco. He traveled to Brazil when he was 17, and he got hired as a visual artist for one scientific expedition. okay? So that's what he was supposed to do there. He was in the middle of the explorations in the Amazon. Most of the crew died, right? For many reasons, and he's the only one that is still alive. And in this, very sad process, he discovered that beyond representing the birds, it would be very important to record the songs of the bird, the sounds of nature. And because there was no printing press in Brazil when he finally got to a place that was like a small town where he will live, he started to work in a technique that he called photography. There is like a system to create, let's say, photocopies based on photochemical reaction of gold chloride. Right? So what I've been doing is trying to tell this story. Something that I probably didn't mention is that one very important thing is that to negotiate with one established field, that is in this case the history of optical media, let's say, to environmental media, right? To connect why the motivation behind this invention of photography is actually the interaction with the Amazonic landscape, right? So here we are, right? Like I'm trying to negotiate with some concepts from Zielinski, deep time. The artifact is photography, like this system, to create like photocopies based on chemical reactions in Brazil at the time. The history is unbelievable because we are talking about imperial Brazil. Brazil, when it became independent, was not a republic, that as most of the other Latin American countries, but an empire for many decades. And the scientific expedition was Russian, led by a Prussian scientist, right? So it was like a mix of interesting colonial powers trying to find a place, right? Alaska was still part of Russia. So Russia had a really strong interests in the Americas. The person that wrote about this process in Brazil is Boris Kosoy, and he talks a lot about the concept of parallel invention, right? Especially in photography, it's very interesting to see parallel invention of photography. And the reconstruction that I did is try to go and work again with gold chloride, that is the chemical that used Hercule Florence, and try to see if the description was consistent. And it was, right? So I was able to work again, and today, let's say, with more time, we can be doing a workshop, right? Bringing alive gold chloride techniques, sometimes mixing with other techniques like cyanotypes and things like that. So jumping to the 20th century, first part of the 20th century, there is a Mexican inventor, Guillermo González Camarena, who developed one of the first system of color television that's actually possible to implement. There were a couple of other systems before, but it was really big, really bulky, in one room. He was able to design an adapter for black and white cameras, right? And build an entire kind of company based on his achievements. It's like a RGB spinning wheel that spins in front of the camera and the TV set at the same time, synchronized and in phase, right? Red, red, blue, blue, and so on. And yeah, so then, I try to do the same, engage with one key author, Media Materiality by Kittler, study what was the state of Mexican post-revolutionary times. They had this revolution in the 20s. And in the 30s, the impact of technologies like radio was very high. People were crazy about radio. Even artists doing, like some avant-garde movements, doing radio transmissions, like with a kind of sound-based poetry, things like that. Rubén Gallo, who works in Princeton, he developed the concept of Mexican modernity to talk about this process of adaptation of radio in Mexico and the cultural impact. But he doesn't talk about like the people who were technicians working and developing their own radio equipment, and at the end, television equipment, and then color television equipment, right? To put things in perspective, in Colombia, my home country, color television arrived in 1982. This story is in 1939. He even got the patent here in the States. And it's really long and complicated story, but had like interesting impact in the history of color television later on. Another example, this is the first inventor that I was able to interact with. He already died, but at the time was alive, like 10 years ago. His name is Jose Vicente Azuar, and he developed this beautiful computer here called the Digital Analog Computer, Musical Computer Azuar, right? He built the entire thing. He got the first Intel Turing Complete board. He programmed the entire thing, developed a firmware, developed a software to work with musical notation, right? Create the system to generate the sound. It was with timers, right? That created like square waves. And then because the square waves were like unexpressive, you know, like old mobile phones, like beep, 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 he was able to develop this entire module for analog process and transform the square wave into, sine waves and actually being able to compose music in also a performative way. He developed, like everything, the keyboard, the monitor. This is before any PC arrived to Chile. So I think that this is really the personal computer, right? Like someone who develops a computer for his own practice, let's say. When he launched this, he already had 10 years composing with computers, in banks and things like that, but it was like, composing the scores and then later on playing, with a live band or group. But in this case, the computer was able to generate sound. So same thing, I'm trying to connect with Curtis Rhodes, stochastic music. The ideas that Jose Vicente Azuar described in the papers about this computer and the software behind, it's what we could call today AI. He's looking for musical ideas from the computer, musical ideas coming from the computer. And we developed like the musical notation system and an implementation of that in a Raspberry Pi, to see how was it. And it reminds like techno music a bit. For repetitive patterns, it works well. So, and one thing that is very interesting to me, and connects also this scholarly component with my artistic practice, is to work in the practical domain, right? Like what we see on top here is the reconstruction of the photographic process from Brazil using the gold chloride, right? Like developing the negatives and exposing directly to the sunlight and getting multiple copies of the same negative. Trying to also connect with the environment. The original motivation were the sounds of the birds. So now I'm doing workshops with people, recording first, nature, birds in different places, and then using this technique to create kind of visualizations using the gold chloride. This is a reconstruction of the RGB camera, television camera, and because it was one part of the story is related to space exploration. If you go to Mexico, they said, this guy developed the camera that was used in the Apollo missions. And in the Apollo missions, you go and check the technical specifications, and the camera they use is one camera with the color wheel system. But it came from another inventor. That's a Hungarian inventor. So even though that, as a researcher, I need to tell that, what I found, is no connection between these NASA cameras and the cameras by González Camarena. They could, and they were actually even better technically to the ones that were actually referenced in the NASA system. So I decided to do this reconstruction and also send that to the, in the cheapest way to go to space and get, with the reconstruction of the camera, a take of the near space landscape that is 20 kilometers with a weather balloon, right? You can go to near stratosphere, it's called, right? And you can see like, the curvature of the Earth and things like that. And I just mentioned this, like the implementation of the software, a complete model of the software of Jose Vicente Azuar in a Raspberry Pi, right? And open source, and other people use it for a while. So that is something that is very important to me. And let me see if we are fine with time. I think we are. jump to the second part that probably is more interesting for you, right? Site tracking is more related to hardware and software studies. Let's say the previous example, this one is kind of a example that opens this interest in computing. At the beginning, there were no clear references between, history of computing and things happening in Latin America. Now I can say that we have an entire field of research with other colleagues. And I'm going to talk about two things. One is the invention of the Lua scripting language in Brazil, 1993. Any of you have used Lua? Maybe you did, but you don't know. So we will check that now. And also the history of wiring, which is the board that was the predecessor of Arduino, right? So let's go there. So the scripting side of the moon. So second part of the book, site tracking, Lua, scripting side of the moon. It's in Brazil in 1993, right? So in 1993, and it's still active, it was created Lua, an extensible embedded programming language, scripting language. It has 4 main technical characteristics. It's closed platform. That means that it's platform independent. Lightweight. It has like a small memory footprint, only 300K, right? So less than an image, like, I don't know, one sticker in a mobile phone, right? It works with a minimalist syntax. That is super important, and we will address that later on. It's multi-paradigm. You can do procedural or object-oriented. And it's embedded. It runs inside hardware or software. So it works really well interfacing things, right? So why is this important today? So it is important because it's a programming language developed entirely in Brazil, and is one of the 3 programming languages created out of North America and Europe that is increasing in use. There are only 3, okay? There are Ruby from Japan, Ruby on Rails with databases, R from New Zealand, and Lua from Brazil, and is the only programming language created in the Global South that is increasing in use, right? There are other, experiments that are more idiosyncratic, but, a language that can be implemented in a project and is actually getting more and more attention, that is something very different. Adaptation of programming languages is a very complex process. It was developed in a research group called TechGraph at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Rio de Janeiro, in Rio de Janeiro. And the main source of funding came originally from Petrobras, that is the national oil company. So, and it's very interesting to see because they were looking in between the 80s and 90s for a way to make the country energy independent in terms of oil. So there was a lot of investment in many technologies, and one of them was like computational technologies, either to simulate or you will see to work in those stations there with a lot of interesting technical challenges. This language was developed for a while, and people, in the context of the research project and, friends of them started to use it. All of them were very happy with the results, how fast it was, especially how easy it was to interface that, code of Lua with C or C++ or other programming languages. And, but it was not adopted because the original license, they wrote their own license in a very kind of strange Portuguese legal language that, nobody really used it. But then they took the MIT license, right? And it really, that is more flexible than copyleft, right? So many people working in the game industry and the software industry started to work with Lua. Some examples are Ginga, that is the implementation of interactive television in Brazil. You probably don't know that, but that was very important at the time there. Examples that you can be more familiar with is the entire interface for Adobe Lightroom was developed in Lua. And the most important one, Angry Birds. Angry Birds, the interaction, it was it was a game that needed to work well in mobile phones at a time that were not that powerful as today, right? So the interface component was developed in Lua. And it was the most downloaded application of 2009, okay? So maybe you have touched some Lua in your life, right? So my question is, okay, so how you historicize something like a programming language, like an artifact that is immaterial, that is related to syntax, grammar, and the history is not that long. Like the oldest implemented programming language came from the same guy who built the C1 and C3 computers in Germany. It's called the Plan Calcul. But that branch was never developed in depth, let's say. Then it starts like a history that has a very strong American flavor with development, especially in the 50s and 60s, that created the entire, set the tone for the entire landscape of programming languages, right? Like the operation of Fortran, Algol, COBOL first, and then later on Lisp, for instance. It was a programming language with the aim to foster artificial intelligence, right? Today, all of that is Python, right? But there was this idea that some specific characteristics of the language will facilitate the development of AI. And then, trying to find a place for languages like Ruby, R, and Lua. But it's a difficult thing to do, historicize programming languages, because there are things that are a little bit more obvious for people like me, like the human understandability and the syntax and semantic processes. But the mathematical abstractions and things like that require more knowledge, right? And are a little dry. But it's very important to go that road to understand a little bit. Something very interesting, for instance, that is the history of programming languages is a field created by Jane Samet, making it, like a very interesting case for gender studies, right? Like a women leading this idea, and for her, the understanding of the history of computing and the programming languages in particular helped people to program better, let's say. The historical knowledge helped them better to understand the basic concepts behind programming and programming languages in general. Also in the 70s, same decade, and she was also, she wrote one of the programming languages, wrote a book, and helped to establish the ACM History of Programming Languages Conference. That is a conference that happens only every 10 years, right? Because the field moves slower than others. So, and the interesting thing with Lua is that in the ACM History of Programming Languages 3 in 2007, Lua was invited for the first time, a Latin American country for the first time to present a programming language. These are the two developers. There's one missing here, Roberto Jerusalimsky there, and Luis de Figueiredo, who's the mathematician here. I had the opportunity to work with them, meet them twice. It's like tremendously competent team and super relaxed at the same time. Brazilian vibe. It's like they talk about the things like, it was very hard, but it was fun as well to work in something like this, and we were kind of in love with the idea of making an elegant programming language that was very economic and things like that. So it's been fantastic. And then I've been trying to understand why. Why Brazil was able to have people competent like them, right? Like, of course, like the requirements from Petrobras and the funding was there somehow, but it requires a deeper historical explanation. So the thing is that Brazil, since the 70s and changing, let's say, different parts of the political spectrum, always had a Brazilian informatics policy that was very protective. For instance, they were not allowed to import computers from the same brand. So they acquired Ferranti this year, and to prevent to be too dependent on that kind of computers, next year they acquired IBM. and next year, for instance, for Petrobras, right, for instance. So they end up with a mix of mainframes with totally different configurations, you know. At that time, it was very, very complex. And at the same time, they tried very hard to have a domestic market, first producing their own PCs, called Cobra, and also creating clones of computers built somewhere else, like this, that is a clone of the Spectrum, the small British computer. And look at that one. They tried to produce the first Mac clone that, of course, Apple didn't like much. But they were able to have prototypes working and everything, right? So this is just to give, you know, one example of how active this field of computing was in Brazil, given to these kind of protective policies. There is a fantastic book by Professor Emanuel Adler. He's from Uruguay originally. He teaches in Toronto about this entire history, right? Like how Brazil was looking for computational autonomy, tried to connect with local industry. They embarked in the idea of creating their own PC and failed, let's say, right? And this book, you know, it's a clear explanation of these intertwined elements. So there is a historical explanation for this kind of advanced seen in computer sciences and engineering. To me, the most important thing of Lua is that they develop a language that creates an inverse interpretation of the Moore's law, right? Like the idea of the numbers of transistors that fit in one equipment, right? And people believe that then we should focus in the latest computers who are the more powerful, right? But instead, Lua, what they recognize is that, especially in the global south, you will have a lot of computers from different generations working and performing different tasks, because computers are not replaced that often. And you end up with this very mixed ecosystem of computers, and you need tools that are able to work in all of them. And Lua is one of them. And that is the success of the programming language as a computational tool. There's been interesting research about it. Yuri Taktyev is a Russian scholar working in Canada. He wrote a book that has a chapter on Lua. He asked questions like, can software be from somewhere? Is Brazilian software like Brazilian music? And he is very concerned why these Brazilian engineers decided to have the reserved words in English instead of Portuguese, let's say, right? Instead of having, you know, their local language reflected in the programming language. And what I say is that, of course, they want to have like an international impact. So they decided to go with the lingua franca, right, behind. But in the economy of the elements is where the kind of Brazilian culture is reflected, in my opinion. You know, they use only 21 reserved words. And the most astonishing thing, only one data structure mechanism, a table. So minimalist syntax, powerful computationally, okay? And that economy, you know, that this idea to be very clever with minimal resources is what I think is somehow a Brazilian component, right? Or the approach to computation. So turning to things that are more fun, where it's been very important, Lua? In the gaming industry. Mainly because for games like Roblox is the language in which the kids program their own games. You know, Roblox is a platform for gaming, but also to program your own games, right? And many kids are learning how to programming games within the Roblox environment, and the Roblox language is Lua, right? So this, for instance, was, I think this was produced here in Massachusetts, was the bestseller of the Lua programming books, and it was written by, at a time, Brandon LaRoche was 13 years old. So Lua is fulfilling this idea of a language that can help kids learn programming. That is being, a golden quest, and it's been very hard. And, because it's connected to this gaming platform environment, I think it's fulfilling that somehow. It's huge. You can check, tutorials of, 12-year-old kids teaching other 12-year-old kids how to program. And the tutorials are really good, really good. And for me, let's say, beyond just, the explanation historically of the what Emmanuel Adler does, that is it, the economic context, I also try to connect with the history of computer graphics in Brazil, right? Especially talking about Valdemar Cordeiro. He, in the 1969, started to do these that are the first computer-based art projects in Brazil. And look at that, it's all about how code can create images, but make visible the code, yeah? Instead of using the code and create like a abstract geometry, for instance, that happened in other places. They even decided to do derivatives of one machine, of one image, with the idea of creating variations, filters of one image. But before that, they were engaged in experiments of poetry, experimental poetry. The same team. And they were trying to create like combinations of consonants and vowels, right? In words of 3 of these combinations, and with a score of how likely that word could be a Brazilian, a word in Portuguese, right? And for instance, this batata got a very high number because it's actually a word that exists in Portuguese. So there's a very interesting tradition also in the arts on experimenting with language at the computational level. The most interesting thing, and this is how I will close this case, is that in many ways, people until a couple of years ago, they presented this as poetry experiments. But actually, what is written in the code is that it is experimental software. So they already had pieces of software art in the 60s. And this is a connection that is really mind-blowing. So here's the evidence, Programa Beabá, created by Valdemar Cordeiro, and they presented not just the result, but also the code. So that is how I try to connect the history of the arts as well with the development of Lua, programming language. I'm gonna just show some slides of the last chapter. It's about wiring. It's called Tangible Interaction in Tangible History. It's the story of this very interesting piece of hardware that actually gave origin to Arduino. It was a master's thesis at the School of Interaction in Ivrea. It happened in Ivrea, where 100 years before, a revolution at the technical level started with the introduction of the portable typewriters. Then 100 years later, Hernando Barragan, a Colombian engineer, started to develop his master's project, and he developed this interesting piece of hardware, with the idea to teach people interaction design. He created the entire environment, the board, the tutorials, the system to teach. He was working at the time with Casey Rees, right, who was graduated from here, from the MIT Media Lab. And it's an evolution from design by numbers processing and the language of wiring, right? What he did was amazing, is not to just stop here, with the schematics of electronics, but try to explain for every example, in drawings, how to connect every single example that was part of wiring, right? This was later on, of course, absorbed in the Arduino culture, but the first time that we can see is in his master's thesis and the website that he created, and also several components of the language. I won't talk about the language that much, but it's also a very interesting idea that, now we see, oh, this pin is input or output or things like that, and it is the number 13, whatever, and those are registers, right, in principle, technically. So it was a work in the interface of design and also the language development. The interesting thing is that as soon as he graduated from Iberia, he took the project back to Colombia, and the domain name was in Colombia, whiting.org.co. Then, let's say, Arduino took off, and for a long while, it was not recognized, their role, until in 2013 here at the MIT, there was an open hardware summit with a session on forking and accreditation. And many people started to recognize that the influence, and actually that many of the ideas that are credited to Arduino come directly and traceable from Whiting. So I'm trying, I will conclude mentioning the following. How I approach this participation of Hernando in this Ivrea Design School is the importance of the history of design schools, right? Like Ivrea Design School took the logo from Bauhaus, as you can see, right? And between Bauhaus at the beginning of the 20th century and the Interaction Design Institute Ivrea in the beginning of the 21st century, it was the Ulm School of Design. You're probably familiar with that, right? Like technology and design. And there were many people, or a couple of people at least, that moved from Latin America to the Ulm School. One is Tomás Maldonado, who's very important in architecture, of course, and he was engaged in designing one of the first computer interfaces for Olivetti in Italy, okay? His student, Guy Bonsiep, traveled from Germany to South America. He wrote the first book about interface in Spanish, called From the Object to the Interface, right? Because was one person who was dealing with industrial design and then discovered how to apply these principles to software interaction. And what I think the value of what Hernando did is to take the lessons from the interface, because he was a computer engineer, and apply to the design of one object, which is the Arduino board, right? Like when we take this board, what we can see is that it's a very complicated process behind the design of the board to be able to sell that or to distribute that as a piece of technology that doesn't have a skin. Because many of the features that we try to find in the skin are already embedded in the object. And that's all for today. Okay, so I'm open to questions or comments. Is that okay, time-wise? Please.
So the stories are fascinating, and here comes my sales pitch to the audience. If you want to read about these incredible inventors and inventions in depth, buy the book or get it from our library, because
Please.
they are incredible. I've read all the chapters, and they're incredible stories, each one of them. So, but I have a general question. So, how well known or celebrated were these different inventors in their home countries? So, they're not known. Whoops, we missed the whole beginning of my. We know that they're not well known in the Western world, in the global North, but how well known were they as individuals in their home countries?
That's a very good question, and touches one point that I think is critical. In many cases, these inventors were not understood in their time. They were recognized as kind of smart, weird people, but in many ways, for them to get access to resources, funding, was always very hard, right? And then it's a perverse mechanism that when they are out of business or when they die, eventually they are credited for much more than what they did. That is the example of the Mexican inventor that he created this color television system. later on created a color television system that was a competitor for NTSC or PAL at the global level, just that he died when this was happening. But instead of being credited for that, he's credited for this idea that his cameras inspired the cameras that went to the moon and things like that. So it's a very perverse mechanism. And in Brazil, with the inventor of photography, happens the same. People, because there is absence of research, people believe that this photographic system that we are talking about was using a camera, and it was not. It was a system for kind of photocopies, you know, with the negative drawn by hand, but being able to get multiple copies because of the chemical synthesizing the paper. So unfortunately, let's say if I see one important component of the book is a self-criticism to Latin American societies and the relationship with technology. It's also reclamation to say we need to rebuild our connection with technology. I studied it in a moment that the technology was not part of our history, canonical history. And when it appeared, it was always the process of transfer, right? When the trains arrived to Colombia or Mexico, and I think there are like a lot of interesting examples as technology is a human practice, right? A human kind of condition. It's a way to engage with the world. There is a very important need to do research about it. And it plays a role at the global level because it brings difference, which is the title of the book, right? We need to pay attention to for more diverse way to practice, understand technology, because the forces that drive technology today are so big that they have like enormous impact, and the risk of having a unified kind of monocultural technological view in some aspects is really there, is visible. So I think this can be a contribution in that direction, yes. Mm-hmm. Please. Mm-hmm.
Where do you think, like nowadays, do you see any like interesting ecosystems where you feel like there's a lot of energy in this kind of area? I don't know, like a specific example of region in Brazil or...
Yeah, what I think, what I've been identifying, doing this research is that, of course, there are like many places in Latin America that have like interesting histories. Some are usual suspects, let's say Mexico, Brazil, but Guatemala, for instance, has a very interesting history regarding computation. For instance, they got the first computer that was built in the UK for economic explanation, like to explain an economical model of one country. It was built working with water, like a big simulation with tanks. 14 of those machines were built, and one of them went to Guatemala. And it was kind of the first computer that arrived to Latin America. And it had like a very interesting explanation because it was a new government that wanted to explain people how economics work better. And later on in the 70s, many people from Guatemala work with the EAT, experiments in arts and technology, from the States, especially with satellites to develop systems for satellite education, satellite television education. So, and the same happens, let's say, in Asia and Africa. My task now is to see if we can develop a network of people, researchers, that can facilitate these negotiations of mutual learning. Of course, always coming to places like MIT, right? Like we need to interface with what is happening at the global level. But what I can see is there's plenty of interesting case studies, but the conceptual tools, we still need to work a lot, especially for the comparison, let's say, contextualization of the projects. Some projects that can be similar eventually have like different reasons, and vice versa. But I think it's one of the most important tasks that we have to explain what the world is today. So luckily, Terry is paying attention to that and help us publish the book in her book series collection. Yeah. Of course.
So I remember that slide you showed about someone proposing. You showed a slide where someone proposed that Brazilian, I forget, something Brazilian was similar to Brazilian software programming.
Brazilian music to Brazilian software.
Yeah, so I want to probe a little bit. What are your thoughts about the manifestation of culture in technological inventions? Do you think, I mean, I think some of it is apocryphal. It's like it's not really believable. But how much credence do you give to the manifestation of culture in technological development? Do you see any of that in any way,
Yeah.
or do you want to not go out on that branch?
No, I think it's a totally valid question, and it's a very hard one, right? That's why I'm trying to, address it. I think in many of the case studies that I did research on, there's some components of the local culture that are manifested in the technological solutions or proposals. But sometimes it's not in the most evident places, right? Like in the case of the software, we can say, like the legitimate question by Taktajev is why a Brazilian programming language is not using Portuguese for the reserved words, right? That would be kind of more evident. And for me, that is tricky because they were educated in a very international domain, and they knew that to validate and to get feedback about the efficiency of the language would be more strategic to have this lingua franca behind. But there are other elements, and I think the use of very few tools and be very economic is part of Brazilian culture, and that is somehow reflected in the development of the software. And I proposed this idea to them, right? Do you think that maybe this is related? And they were like, what? Like, we haven't think about it, but that is when things start to be interesting, right? The good thing with Lua or Wiring is that the inventors are still there. You can go and interface with them. They were blown away with the pieces of art and software art from Brazil in early times. They were like, what is this? And they were able to, they understand Fortran very well, so they were able to read the code, understand. I was explaining, but for them, the explanation is, no, let me check the code. Okay, so they are doing, so the index for the words comes from, and for them was really interesting. So sometimes there are things that are part of the culture that are eventually even hidden, and part of the job that we do is try to make this cultural connection more provocative, maybe.